Lost Islamic History, Reclaiming Muslim Civilization from the Past is a book written by Firas Alkhateeb, an Islamic history teacher with a master's in Middle Eastern history with a specialization in Islamic intellectual history. The book is essentially a look at the entire history of Islam, from pre-Islamic Arabia to now, almost 1,500 years later, with the Islamic world in disarray. Al-Khatib mentions in his opening that his students knew a lot about various parts of history, but when questioned on Islamic history, knowledge was lacking, which spurred him on to write this work, an extensive and detailed look at the incredibly rich history of Islam, and yet incredibly, in a short 200-page or so summary. There are around 2 billion Muslims in the world. That is around 25% of the population of Earth. Islam is one of the most powerful religious, social, political, spiritual and military forces in the world, and has been since its inception. It has incited empires that lasted for hundreds of years, territories which ranged from southern France to East Africa and Southeast Asia. The history of Islam is incredible, the characters rich, the stories entrenched in legend, the spread miraculous, the contributions to science and humanities unquestionable. However, when one talks to the average person today, due to the media they consume, they are often completely ignorant of the history of Islam, despite it often playing a direct role in the shaping of the life of the person being interrogated. What they do think they know will often be related to terrorism. I've even spoken to Muslims who have no idea what the Ottoman Empire was, even though it lasted almost 800 years and was only recently abolished around 100 years ago or so. I know Muslims don't even know that Spain was a Muslim nation for 700 years, or that the creator of the scientific method was a Muslim, or that the Islamic world is in part responsible for the European Renaissance, etc., etc. The point is, there's an ocean of history that is being ignored and forgotten. And in a time and age where I live, in the UK in 21st century Britain, knowing many young Muslims, one of the issues I see today is an identity crisis for these young people. And on top of that, a society and Western media that seeks to constantly bash their faith as something barbaric and backward. But if only these youngsters had a connection to their Islamic history, they would have contentment and firmness and appreciation and pride of their religion. For example, repeated remarks in the streets from bigots labelling someone a dirty Muslim would not cause an inferiority complex when the victim is aware that his religion's practices dictate washing his hands, brushing his teeth, and bathing regularly, literally 1,000 years before these things became commonplace in the West. And even then, the Western world has yet to catch up, with Islam telling its followers to regularly wash the inside of the nose and to wash the private parts after discharging bodily waste, which is still not a cultural norm in the West. The point being, the hygiene standard of Islam, as an example, is light years ahead of the post-Enlightenment, liberal, secular Western world, which has regressed so much that we're at a stage where people don't even know if they're men or women or not. Now, if Muslims were educated about their past, they'd have a backbone and would no longer look to a regressing Western secular world as the be-all, end-all in terms of society and civilization. At the very least, you'd hope that these drug-dealing kids of today would look at Muhammad al-Fatih, who conquered Constantinople at the age of 21, and they would be inspired to make something of themselves, do something with their lives. Perhaps similar thinking is what sparked Al-Khatib to write this brilliant book, a book which is so simple and yet touches almost on every aspect of Islamic history, with the review from Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan proudly displayed on the back. I did wonder why the book was even called Lost Islamic History, as it's basically an entry-level, easily readable summary, but looking back it makes sense. It's a very important book, one that I would highly recommend. After telling the story of the Prophet Muhammad and his mission, Al-Khatib details the contributions of Muslim thinkers and scientists like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Battuta, Ibn Sina, warriors such as Khalid bin Walid and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, scholars and theologians like Abu Hanifa and Imam Ghazali, and entire dynasties such as the Rashiduns, the Umayyads, the Abbasids and the Ottomans. And he does so in a story-like fashion, with a wonderful flow and pace. The book does not at all feel in any way like a study material, something analytical and dry. It's fun to read. Some of the stuff covered is so interesting, and the author is able to recap complex events in simple fashion to make it easy to understand. Things like the Sunni-Shia split, the establishment of the 4 madhabs, the Ash'ari, Athari and Maturidi schools of thought, the rise of Wahhabism, etc., etc. And it's a great work for putting historical events into context, knowing who was in charge when a certain famous event happened, putting names to scientific discoveries, things like that. And Al-Khatib doesn't just give some rosy picture of the past so we can daydream about living in a utopia like caliphate. It's a warts and all look at the history of Islam, showing disputes that occurred, mistakes that were made and can be learned from. European colonization of Muslim lands is covered in great detail, and the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of nationalism and secularism in Islamic nations, and all of the other stuff which has caused the Muslim world so many problems. Rather than simply focus on military expansion and Islamic empires, as a lot of history books do, Al-Khatib gives emphasis to the impact of Islamic belief and personalities on scientific advancement, social structures and cultural development. I would highly recommend Lost Islamic History for being a simple but detailed, comprehensive and easily readable book charting the history of Islam.